I don't know why I'm telling this story. Maybe it's been weighing on me for too long. Or maybe I just need someone, anyone, to hear it. I used to work as a night security guard at a cemetery. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid well enough. And honestly, I liked the quiet. The dead don't cause problems. At least, that's what I used to believe. The cemetery wasn't massive, but it was old. Some graves had been there for over a century, their headstones weathered and crumbling. But there was a newer section, a place where the freshly buried were laid to rest. That's where all of this happened. That's where I saw something I'll never forget. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I spotted it. I was doing my usual rounds, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, when the beam landed on a patch of disturbed dirt. I stopped, my stomach twisting. A grave had been dug up. My first thought was grave robbers, but as I stepped closer, my breath hitched. The casket was open. Someone had pried it apart. And inside was the body of a young woman. But she wasn't alone. A man was lying in the coffin with her. I froze. The sight was so bizarre, so grotesque, that my brain struggled to process it. He was curled up beside her, his arms wrapped around her stiff, lifeless body, as though he were cradling a lover in bed. His face was buried in her neck, his fingers gently touching her cold skin. Then, he turned his head and looked right at me. His eyes, I can't even describe them properly. There was something wrong about the way he looked at me, like I was the intruder, not him. Like I was interrupting something intimate. My instincts kicked in, and I shouted, "Hey, get the hell out of there!" The man bolted. He leaped from the grave with an inhuman speed, scrambling over the dirt like a wild animal. I took off after him, my flashlight beam bouncing across the tombstones. I'm not out of shape, but this guy was fast. Too fast. He dodged through the cemetery like he knew it. Like he'd spent hours walking these paths. No matter how hard I ran, I couldn't keep up. Then, just like that, he was gone. Vanished into the darkness. I reported everything to the cemetery director first thing in the morning. The police were called, and by noon, officers were swarming the site, asking questions and reviewing the security footage. That's when we realized something even more disturbing. There was no security footage. The cameras had been disabled. Not cut, just turned off. Someone had known exactly how to access the system. That someone had been him. A deep, sinking feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't random. This wasn't some lunatic wandering in off the streets. This was planned. Then we learned about her. The woman in the grave. I'd like to keep her real name secret out of respect. So for the sake of context, let's call her Emily. She was 23. She had died just 2 days prior in a car accident. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The man in the coffin? He wasn't a stranger. He had known Emily. He had been obsessed with her. Turns out, this guy had been stalking Emily for months before she died. He had followed her social media, tracking her every move. He had sent her messages, hundreds of them, professing his love, his devotion. At first, they were just creepy, but then they turned violent. Emily had blocked him, reported him, even filed a restraining order with the police. But a piece of paper doesn't stop a true obsessive. He had watched her, followed her, even found out where she lived. Her parents had tried to protect her. They installed security cameras, changed her daily routine. But none of it mattered in the end. A freak accident took her life. A car crash on a rainy night. But to him, her death didn't mean it was over. In his twisted mind, she still belonged to him. After that night, he never came back. Maybe he realized the cemetery was being watched. Maybe he moved on to some other obsession. Or maybe, just maybe, he got what he wanted. Emily's parents, shattered by grief and disgusted by what had happened, made a heartbreaking request. They wanted their daughter moved. They couldn't bear the thought of that man knowing where she rested. So they had her remains exhumed and transferred to a private cemetery in another state. A place no one but family could access. A place he would never find. I still wonder if he ever went looking. I still wonder if, even now, Years later, he's searching for her. Maybe he found a new grave, a new obsession. And maybe, just maybe, he's still out there, waiting, watching, looking for the next Emily. I don't know why I held on to this story for so long. Maybe I didn't want to believe it was real, but it was real. And now that you know, I have to ask, what if her freak car accident wasn't actually an accident? What if he had something to do with it? Maybe he tried having her in life but couldn't, so he decided to have her in death. And do you think he ever really stopped? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you ever feel like someone is watching you, trust your instincts. Because sometimes the scariest monsters aren't ghosts or demons. Sometimes they're just people. Before we continue, I'd like to let you know there are a lot of people like Emily who are being stalked and need to hear this story so they could take more drastic actions towards stalkers. But they can't hear this story unless you subscribe, like, and share this story so these stories could be pushed to many more people. So please like, subscribe, and share these stories to save someone today. I never wanted to be a cemetery administrator. It just kind of happened, like most things in life that end up changing you forever. After 15 years working at the town's memorial gardens, I'm finally ready to share why we had to implement the photography ban in the East section. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar and can help me make sense of what we discovered. I started as just another groundskeeper back in 2001, fresh out of college with a business degree and desperate for any job. The town's memorial gardens was this sprawling 150-acre property on the outskirts of town, with sections dating back to the 1850s. The east section was our crown jewel, beautiful Victorian monuments, century-old oak trees, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that made it a popular spot for both mourners and photographers. The trouble began in spring 2002. A local photographer, Sarah Chen, came to my office visibly shaken. She'd been shooting a memorial service the day before and wanted to show me something on her developed photos. I remember how her hands trembled as she spread the prints across my desk. The photos looked normal at first. Grieving family, flowers, the typical somber scene. But then she pointed to the background. Behind the mourners, partially hidden by a massive granite headstone, stood a man in what looked like a 1940s suit. He was staring directly at the camera, his face a mask of absolute anguish. "I didn't see anyone there when I took these," Sarah whispered. "And look at this one." The next photo, taken moments later according to the timestamp, showed a different figure. A woman in a high-necked Victorian dress, standing in exactly the same spot, with the same unsettling stare toward the camera. I tried to dismiss it as double exposure or some trick of the light. But over the next few months, more photographers came forward. Each roll of film shot in the east section contained these mysterious figures. They never appeared in the same place twice, but they always stared directly at the camera, wearing clothes from different eras spanning our cemetery's history. The breaking point came during a wedding photo shoot. Yes, some people actually wanted their wedding photos taken in our more scenic sections. The photographer's entire roll showed dozens of these figures standing among the wedding party. Men, women, and even children from different decades, all with those haunting, accusatory stares. The bride became hysterical when she saw the photos. That's when we had to implement the ban. Here's where it gets worse. When digital cameras became common, we thought the problem would stop. Instead, it evolved. Digital photos from the east section started showing distinctive blur marks where the figures would have been. Not normal motion blur. These were perfect vertical streaks, like tears in the fabric of the photo itself. I've spent years going through our burial records, trying to match the figures in those original photos to our internment records. So far, I've identified 17 of them. Every single one died under mysterious circumstances. Some were ruled suicides but had family members who insisted otherwise. Others were unsolved murders or disappearances where only partial remains were found. The most disturbing connection? They were all buried in other sections of the cemetery. None of them in the east section where their figures appear in photos. Last month, I found a document in our archives from 1899. It detailed plans for a mass relocation of bodies from the original east section to make room for the Victorian monuments that stand there now. The wealthy families of that era wanted prestigious plots with impressive views. According to the document, 186 bodies were supposed to be moved, but our records only show 169 reburials. Those missing 17 bodies? The dates and names match perfectly with the figures I've identified in the photographs. I'm sharing this now because last week, a visitor's smartphone camera captured something new. Instead of the usual blur marks, there was a clear image of all 17 figures standing together, pointing toward a specific spot near the oldest oak tree. We haven't dug there. Not yet. But ground-penetrating radar shows there's something about 6 feet down. If anyone reading this has experienced something similar at other cemeteries, please let us know in the comment section. There's something bigger going on here, and I feel like these 17 souls are trying to tell us something. For those asking, yes, I still have copies of the original photos locked in my office. No, I won't post them publicly. The last person who scanned and tried to share them online had their computer completely wiped the next day. I have to go now. The motion sensors in the east section just went off again, and the cameras are showing those familiar blur marks moving between the headstones. Tonight feels different, though. Tonight, they seem to be gathering. What would you do if you discovered that the dead in your cemetery had living proxies? That's not a hypothetical question. I've spent the last 3 years trying to untangle the most disturbing scheme I've ever encountered in my 17 years of cemetery management. I took over as head groundskeeper at a memorial cemetery in 2019, and like most people in this profession, I never planned for this career. Life has a way of leading you down unexpected paths, doesn't it? The pay was decent, the work was peaceful, and I figured managing a 200-acre cemetery would be straightforward. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started with small things, the kind of details only someone who walks these grounds daily would notice. Certain old graves, ones that hadn't had visitors in decades according to our records, were being maintained meticulously. Fresh flowers appeared weekly, the grass was hand-trimmed, and the headstones were kept spotlessly clean. At first, I was grateful. Budget cuts had left us understaffed, so any help maintaining the grounds was welcome. Then I noticed the patterns. All the mysteriously maintained graves were from before 1940. All of them belonged to people whose family lines had died out or moved away generations ago. And all of them had been wealthy, really wealthy in life. I might have left it alone if I hadn't caught Marcus, one of our gravediggers, showing a homeless man around Section C at midnight. I followed them, keeping my distance, as Marcus pointed out specific graves and consulted a worn notebook. I couldn't hear everything, but phrases like unclaimed estate and legal inheritance drifted back to me. The next day, I started digging, through records, not dirt. Marcus had been working here for 8 years, longer than any other staff member. He had access to all our historical documents, including original deeds and estate information. What I found in his maintenance shed made my blood run cold. He had files, dozens of them. Each contained detailed information about wealthy individuals buried in our cemetery who had no living heirs. Alongside these were profiles of homeless people he'd recruited, their photos, biographical information, and meticulous instructions about grave maintenance responsibilities. Marcus had created what he called the Grave Adoption Program. He convinced homeless people that if they maintained a specific grave for 1 year, establishing a pattern of care and devotion, they could legally claim to be distant relatives of the deceased. The goal? Access to unclaimed estate funds that had been sitting in banks for decades. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. In the mausoleum basement, I found evidence that some of his adopters had been living there for months. They'd created a bizarre underground community. Each person assigned to specific graves they tended like sacred gardens. They performed rituals at night, wearing clothes from their adopted relatives' era, leaving personal items at the graves as proof of their connection. The worst part? It was starting to work. One of Marcus's first recruits, a woman named Ellen, had successfully convinced a probate court she was related to a wealthy industrialist buried here in 1922. She'd maintained his grave for 2 years, learned every detail of his life, and even named her cat after his wife. The court granted her access to an estate worth over $300,000 in today's money. But what about the real families? What about the actual distant relatives who might exist somewhere? And what happens to the dignity of the dead when their resting places become commodities to be traded? I found Marcus's master list. He had identified over 200 eligible graves and had already assigned 43 of them to his recruits. Each adopter was required to sign a contract promising him 30% of any estate funds they managed to claim. Have you ever stood in a cemetery at night and felt like you were being watched? Try walking through one knowing that living people are hiding among the dead, practicing how to become them. Last week, I caught one of the adopters, dressed in full 1930s clothing, hosting a tea party at her assigned grave. She had placed photos of herself among actual family photos on the headstone, creating a false history. When I confronted her, she spoke about her great-uncle with such conviction that for a moment I almost believed her. What would you do in my position? Report everything and potentially make dozens of homeless people lose their only chance at a better life? Or let this elaborate deception continue, watching as the dead's legacies are slowly claimed by strangers? I've documented everything: the contracts, the living spaces in the mausoleum, the elaborate deception methods Marcus taught his recruits. But I haven't turned it in yet. Sometimes at night, I walk past these adopted graves and see fresh flowers, carefully maintained grass, and signs of attention that these forgotten souls haven't received in generations. Is it wrong if someone cares for a grave, even for the wrong reasons? What matters more, the truth of bloodlines or the reality of care and dedication? Marcus disappeared 3 days ago. His recruits are still here, tending their adopted graves with religious devotion. They don't seem to need him anymore. They've become a family of their own, a family tied together by the dead they've claimed as their own. What would you do if you discovered something like this at your local cemetery? Would you intervene, or would you, like me, find yourself paralyzed by the complexity of what's right and wrong in a situation where the dead are silent and the living are desperate? Have you ever seen the earth reject a body? Not metaphorically, I mean literally push a casket back up from the ground like it was spitting out something that didn't belong there. If you haven't, count yourself lucky. I've seen it happen 4 times, all in the same plot, and what we eventually discovered about that piece of land still haunts me. I'm a 3rd-generation gravedigger at a cemetery. My grandfather and father both worked these grounds before me, though neither of them ever mentioned anything about Plot 248. Maybe it never acted up during their time, or maybe they took the secret to their own graves. Either way, I'm breaking our professional silence because people need to know some grounds should never be disturbed. It started in March 2021. Standard burial, elderly woman. Nothing unusual about the service or internment. We laid Mrs. Henderson to rest in Plot 248 on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, the groundskeeper called me in a panic. The earth had shifted, pushing the casket up about 8 inches. Not from frost heave, it was spring, and the ground was soft. Not from water table issues, we're on high ground. The casket just rose. What would you do if you arrived at work to find a casket partially emerged from the earth, completely intact, with no obvious explanation? We did what any professional cemetery staff would do. We reburied it, deeper this time, with extra reinforcement. I spent that whole day questioning my sanity, wondering if the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. 3 days later, it happened again. Same plot, same casket, same impossible emergence. The soil around it was undisturbed, no signs of tampering or animal activity. It was as if the earth itself was rejecting what we'd placed within it. After the 3rd time, yes, we stubbornly tried again, we had to exhume Mrs. Henderson and move her to a different plot. Her family was understandably upset, but we covered the costs and blamed it on unstable ground conditions. If only it were that simple. 2 months later, we tried to use Plot 248 again. Different casket, different family, same result. Within 48 hours, the ground had pushed it up like a cork from a bottle. That's when I started digging into our records, trying to understand what made this particular plot so different. What I found in our archives changed everything I thought I knew about our cemetery's history. The place wasn't always a cemetery. In the late 1800s, this land belonged to the county medical examiner's office. Plot 248, it was where they burned unclaimed bodies. For nearly 20 years, they cremated hundreds of unknown persons there. Vagrants, immigrants, victims of epidemics, anyone whose body went unclaimed. But here's the detail that keeps me up at night. They didn't stop burning bodies there because of changing regulations or public health concerns. They stopped because in 1897, multiple witnesses reported seeing ash from the cremations form humanoid shapes in the air before dispersing. The medical examiner at the time wrote in his journal that the smoke seemed to dance with purpose and carried whispers in languages none could understand. We found an old map from 1899 that marked plot 248 with a simple warning: leave fallow. For over a century, that warning was heeded. The plot remained empty while the cemetery grew around it. Somewhere along the line, the warning was forgotten, the records misplaced, and plot 248 was mistakenly added to our available inventory. Last week, we tried ground-penetrating radar to see if we could understand what's happening beneath the surface. The results made no sense. According to the readings, there's a perfectly spherical void about 6 feet down, like a bubble in the earth, that shouldn't be possible in our soil composition. But that's not even the strangest part. Remember those whispers the medical examiner wrote about? Sometimes when the wind blows just right across plot 248, you can hear them. They're faint, like dozens of voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Our maintenance crew refuses to mow near it now. Birds won't land there. Even the ever-present cemetery deer avoid that patch of ground. What would you do if you discovered a piece of earth that refused to hold the dead? Would you keep trying to use it, seal it off, dig down to that mysterious void to see what's really there? We've officially retired plot 248 from our inventory, but that hasn't stopped the phenomena. Security cameras have caught strange lights hovering over it at night. The grass there grows in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that look almost like letters when viewed from above. And sometimes in the early morning hours we find ash on the ground, fresh ash, arranged in perfect circles. The ground remembers what we make it endure. Sometimes it remembers so strongly that it refuses to accept anything new. What secrets does your local cemetery hold? What warnings have been forgotten? And most importantly, what would you do if you discovered that some ground never forgets its original purpose? If you've experienced anything similar or know of other plots that reject their burials, please share your stories. There's something happening here that goes beyond normal explanation, and I have a feeling plot 248 isn't the only one of its kind. I never wanted to work in a cemetery. I sort of fell into the job after leaving my last security gig. A buddy of mine, who knew I needed steady work, called me up and said the cemetery needed a night shift guard. Easy money, he said. The dead don't cause problems. That's what I thought too, until the exhumation request came in. It started with a lawyer. Some guy in a press suit walked into the cemetery office one afternoon and demanded we exhume a grave. Something about an ongoing investigation. The deceased, a man in his late 50s, had been buried just over a month ago, but now there was a court order to dig him up. I wasn't part of the digging crew, but I was there when they cracked open the casket. The funeral director, a seasoned guy named Hank, stood beside me, arms crossed, face set in a deep frown. The casket lid came off, and everyone froze. The body was wrong. The man was supposed to be resting on his back, hands folded over his chest, like every other person buried in this cemetery. But he wasn't. He was face down, arms outstretched toward the foot of the coffin, like he had been trying to crawl his way out. A cold chill ran through me as I turned to Hank. His normally unshakable expression was gone, replaced with something close to fear. "We buried him properly," he muttered. "I know we did." The lawyer, clearly disturbed, excused himself to make a phone call. The digging crew looked at each other, murmuring in uneasy tones. I wanted to say it was some mistake, some weird shifting of the body due to decomposition, but something about it didn't sit right. Then Hank made a decision that turned our unease into outright horror. He ordered us to check other recent graves. We exhumed 5 more bodies that afternoon. Every single one had moved. One was twisted at an unnatural angle, as if writhing in agony. Another had arms reaching upward, fingers stiff and curled, like they had clawed at the inside of the coffin. The worst was a young woman who had been buried just 2 weeks ago. Her head was turned completely around. The sight made one of the younger workers vomit into the dirt. Hank wiped his sweaty forehead with shaking hands and told us to stop. "No more," he said. "This ain't natural." I should have walked away right then. I should have quit. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. That night I stayed late to check the cemetery's security footage. I had to know if someone was messing with the graves. Maybe grave robbers, maybe a sick prank. What I saw still haunts me. The footage started normal. Just rows of still headstones under the dim glow of the security lights. Hours passed. Then, at around 2:45 a.m., the soil over one of the graves began to shift. Not like something was digging out, like something was rearranging itself underneath. The ground pulsed, rising and falling as if something was moving just beneath the surface. Then, in a slow, methodical rhythm, the shape of the grave seemed to change ever so slightly. I fast-forwarded to the next night. It happened again. Another grave, another subtle shifting of the earth. This wasn't grave robbers. This wasn't a prank. Something beneath the cemetery was moving these bodies. The worst part came when I compared the security footage to a map of the cemetery. I marked each disturbed grave with a red X and stepped back. They weren't random. The bodies were being arranged into a pattern, a spiral. It wasn't perfect yet, but the more I analyzed it, the clearer it became. The disturbed graves formed a shape, a twisting, curling spiral that was slowly forming with each passing night. And at the very center of it was an old, unmarked mausoleum. I had never paid much attention to the mausoleum before. It was one of those forgotten things in the farthest corner of the cemetery, untouched for decades. The record said it belonged to an unnamed family from the 1800s, but no one had visited it in years. That night, against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward it. The moment I got close, I felt it. The air was wrong. Thick, heavy, like stepping into a pressure chamber. My flashlight flickered as I reached the rusted door. The lock had long since broken, and with a hesitant push, the heavy stone door creaked open. The smell hit me first. Earthy, damp, but with an undercurrent of something rotten. Inside, it was empty. Just dust, cobwebs, and crumbling walls. But as I stepped forward, my foot landed on something that made a hollow thunk. I shone my light down. A trapdoor. I stood there, my breath loud in my ears. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity had already led me this far. With a shaking hand, I pulled the trapdoor open. There was a tunnel leading deep beneath the cemetery, and lining its walls were bones. I don't remember running back to my car. I don't remember speeding home, locking my doors, or staying awake until sunrise, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I quit my job. I never told Hank about the tunnel. I never told anyone. But I kept watching the news, waiting to hear about more exhumations, more strange findings. Nothing ever made headlines. And maybe that's the scariest part. Because whatever is beneath that cemetery, it's still there. Still moving bodies. Still forming that spiral. Still waiting for something to be completed. And no one is stopping it. I've tried to forget about it. But some nights when I close my eyes, I still see the shifting earth, the twisted corpses, the tunnel lined with bones. What do you think was down there? What was it trying to arrange? And the real question, if the spiral ever finishes, what happens next?